Good afternoon. We're going to get started. All right. My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the Government Affairs Director at the Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC, and I want to thank you for joining us today. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit with offices both in San Francisco and Sacramento. Sacramento is, of course, the most important office to us here in Sacramento, at least, and to you, I hope. For today's program, we're going to learn about the findings from a new PPIC report titled Assessing California's Redistricting Commission, Effects on Partisan Fairness and Competitiveness, authored by PPIC researcher Eric McGhee, who's enjoying the beer bread. And so that's why I started a little slow, Kelly, so I apologize. You should have received a copy of the report on your chair. There are additional copies at the registration table, and the full report, as well as the slides, are online now at ppic.org. After Eric's presentation, we'll have plenty of time for question and answers, but because we are recording, please wait for one of the nice folks to come around with the microphone so you can be heard by the panel or folks that are looking at us online. Later today, you'll receive a survey. We love to do surveys, and so please take a moment and let us know how you feel about the report, the format, of course, the food. And finally, please turn off and silence your cell phones. This report is incredibly timely in light of two Supreme Court cases that should be decided this year. The first case, Gill versus Whitford, was a challenge to a Republican-controlled legislature following the 2010 census. The second case was a challenge to a redistricting plan enacted by a Democrat-controlled legislature, the Maryland General Assembly, following the 2010 census. These cases raise many interesting issues, but point to the fact that in this hyper-partisan time, there may be one thing that is the last bipartisan thing, and that's gerrymandering. Just done by both parties in different states. Putting your thumb on the political scale has been going on for a long time. The word gerrymandering, which my husband corrected me today and said is gerrymandering, goes back to 1812 when Governor Geary signed a bill that redistricted Massachusetts to benefit his party, the Democrat/Republican Party at the time, for you political scientists. When mapped, one of the contorted districts in the Boston area was said to resemble the shape of a mythical salamander that looked like a dragon. Gerrymandering is combining the governor's last name and the word salamander. For those who are interested, I actually pulled up a political picture, and it'll be in the back room because it's really a fascinating district to look at and looks like a dragon. So we know that manipulating reapportionment has been going on for a long time. But let's step back and consider why a fair reapportionment is important. When the voters cast a ballot, they expect their votes to matter, that they are helping to choose a representative that is responsive, reflective, and accountable to the community they represent. Manipulating lines undermines the public's trust in the electoral process as well as representative government. California voters took redistricting out of the legislature's hand with the passage of Prop 11. Eric's report seeks to answer the questions if the voters got it right, and whether this should be the model for other states like Maryland and Wisconsin if the Supreme Court sets a new standard to stop partisan gerrymandering in the future. I'd like now to introduce Eric McGhee. He is a research fellow at PPIC, where he focuses on elections, legislative behavior, political reform, and surveys and polling. Welcome, Eric.
Okay, can everyone hear me? All right, great. Thank you for that introduction. In 2001, the California Democrats and Republicans in the state legislature drew what you might call a bipartisan gerrymander. Now I'm gonna call it a gerrymander, not a gerrymander, just FYI. The incumbents of both parties were protected by that plan, and it also ignored calls that some people had made for more minority representation. So in response, there was a lot of consternation about that plan, and over the next few years, there were efforts to try and change the system, one that failed, and then in 2008, voters actually adopted a reform that handed the responsibility for drawing the state legislative and Board of Equalization lines to an independent commission for the first time. And then in 2010, there was a follow-on initiative that extended that authority to Congress as well, to drawing the congressional lines. So this report evaluates the commission's work. It evaluates it in two dimensions. One is the fairness to the two major parties, and then the competitiveness. And I'll talk about what I mean by each of those concepts in a little bit. As you just heard, it's a good time to do this. First, because we have a few election cycles under our belt now to be able to take a look at what's been happening on the ground. But also because there's these Supreme Court cases that are being considered right now. One is going to be argued, I think, next week. The other one was argued last October. I've been kind of tied up with all of that because I developed one of the metrics that they're using in the Wisconsin case, and I'll be presenting the results from that metric, evaluating the commission plan here today. And then there's also a number of states that are actually considering a commission-style reform like California has. So it's a good time to sort of see what we got out of the commission reform that we adopted here. So I'll start by giving you a little bit of sort of general background on the California Commission, and then go into discussing the fairness of the plans that they drew, and the competitiveness then of the plans they drew, and then I'll conclude with some recommendations and some conclusions. The Citizen Redistricting Commission, as it was called, CRC, was a big change from the status quo. Before, the plans had been drawn by an elected state legislature. It now shifted to an independent appointed commission. There was a complex process, an application process. The state auditor made decisions about whittling down that pool of candidates, and then there was a random part and so forth. But it was ultimately an appointment process. The legislature had a few constraints, legal constraints, that it had to follow. The districts had to be equal in population. They had to respect the Voting Rights Act, but ultimately not too many. The commission, by contrast, had a long list of specific criteria that were actually prioritized and that they had to try and satisfy in the prioritized order. The legislature had only a handful of public hearings, whereas the commission held dozens of public hearings, streamed them over the internet. For those of you, for like the super nerds who wanted to watch over the internet, I was one of them. And they were required to produce a report that explained the reasons for their decisions, which they did. The legislature could have any partisan coalition that they could manage to cobble together to pass the redistricting bill. Now, as it happens, it was a bipartisan coalition because they had a bipartisan gerrymander back in 2001. The commission had a designated partisan membership and a minimum number of people within each partisan category who had to approve of the plan. So this is an unusual system, right? So there are many other states that have some kind of commission system, but they're not independent in this way. The only other state that really has a truly independent commission, like California's, is Arizona. And right now, their state legislature is trying to change that. So it's an unusual system, but it's being looked at as a model for elsewhere. Now, we'll say among those criteria that were required, fairness and competitiveness were more hoped for than dictated. And what do I mean by these concepts? Well, fairness, generally speaking, I mean that neither party gets too many seats given the vote share that it's getting. And again, I'll talk about my specific definition of that and the details of that in a minute. Competitiveness just means that many seats will change hands as the vote share rises and falls for the different parties. Now, these concepts are different. For instance, imagine a party that gets 55% of the vote, but all of the seats. Now, that seems kind of unfair, at least for most people that would violate our gut sense of fairness. But then imagine that half of those seats are won with just 51% of the vote. So those are all competitive seats, and if the vote share shifted, a bunch of seats would change hands. Right? So it's both unfair in terms of its basic outcome, but also competitive. You can have any combination of those. You could have unfair, and then if there were changes in votes, not many seats would change hands, or not enough to get down to fairness. So the point is that the concepts are distinct. But the law, the commission law, only required, it didn't require fairness and competitiveness. It basically only required that the commission not produce an unfair and uncompetitive plan. It couldn't decide that it wanted to produce something that was unfair. It couldn't decide that it wanted to produce something that favored a particular incumbent, and so was likely to be uncompetitive as well. They were just sort of hoped for ideas. But I think those two concepts are still very important, if only because if they had produced a plan that was strongly biased or uncompetitive, it could be a political killer for the commission. And that's not just true the first time around, it could be true in the future as well. So let's start out with the first of these two, fairness. Were the CRC plans fair? Well, what do I mean by fair? That requires going a little bit down the rabbit hole. How does a gerrymander work? Well, let's first imagine a state that has 50 voters. 20 of those voters are blue, and 30 of those voters are red. We've got the blue party and the red party. No resemblance whatsoever to any parties that you might have heard of otherwise. And we've got these voters laid out in a nice grid here. They've been very nice for us, and they've laid themselves out in a nice square. Now, it's not clear how many, if we were going to draw 5 districts out of this distribution of voters, it's not clear exactly, just looking at exactly how many seats red should get versus blue, but it seems reasonable to think that red would get more seats than blue, because there's more voters than blue. But here's one way you could draw the lines. And if you draw the lines this way, that's just one of many ways, but if you draw the lines this way, there are actually 3 seats for blue and 2 seats for red. Oops. So how do you produce a result like this? Well, the way you do it is with what's called wasted votes and allocating wasted votes. A wasted vote is a vote that does not immediately contribute to a victory. So you can have surplus votes, votes that are cast in excess of the number that are required to win. And you can have what you might call lost votes, votes that are cast for losers. All the votes cast for losing candidates are lost. So gerrymanders simply pack and crack voters to make sure that one party gets more of these wasted votes than others. So what do I mean by packing and cracking? Here are the packed districts in this plan. So you see the original plan. Here are the packed districts. These are districts that red is winning by just an overwhelming margin, 9-1. It doesn't need, the red party doesn't need to win these seats by that large a margin. And there are also not very many blue voters who are stuck in these districts. So those are the lost votes for the blue party, right? Just a couple of them. And here are the surplus votes for the red party. Those are all, they don't need those extra votes in order to claim those districts. They could win with less. These are what you would call the cracked districts. And they're cracked because the losing party, right, in this case, is split across many districts. So they're not quite a majority in any one of them. And so in each of these, blue is winning, but by a much narrower margin, just 6-4. And these are the lost votes for the red party. There's a lot of them, you can see, just as there were a lot of surplus votes in the packed districts. And then there's just, again, just a handful of surplus, surplus votes for blue in this case. So what I did was develop a measure that tries to capture this idea. It's called the efficiency gap. And the efficiency gap just says that a plan is fair if the wasted votes between the two parties are roughly equal. So what it does is it takes the surplus and lost votes for one side and subtracts off the surplus and lost votes for the other side. Takes the difference between them and divides by the total number of votes so that you have a measure that's comparable across different systems. And then in this case, I'm going to multiply by 100 because what you get out of that is a proportion, and I'm going to multiply it by 100 to get a percentage instead. So in the case that the example that I just gave, there were 8 surplus votes for red plus 12 lost votes gets you 20 total. There were 3 surplus votes for blue plus 2 lost votes gets you 5. Difference between 20 and 5 is 15. Divide by 50 times 100, and it's 30%. Now the efficiency gap can range between exactly negative 50% and positive 50%. The actual directionality of this, the positive, negative, is not important. It's just as long as you keep it straight in your head, which way is which. In this case, positive is the way that I set it up. Positive means something favoring blue. Negative means something favoring red. And I will continue that convention throughout this presentation, just taking red and blue and replacing them with Republican and Democrat. So a negative value is Republican, a positive value is Democratic. Doesn't matter which way you do it, right? Just as long as you have that directionality in your head. There's a couple different ways that you can. One other point. So it can range from negative 50% to positive 50%. Typically, though, it only goes from about negative 20 to positive 20, just on the ground. The very worst plans tend to be about negative 20, so this is pretty extreme. And in a paper that I wrote with a legal scholar at University of Chicago, we suggested, based on the historical record, that when you're talking about state legislatures, that you would have an 8% threshold for a gerrymander. So anything that goes beyond 8% is going to be, based on that historical range, we said that's probably something you want to take a second look at. So there's a couple different ways that you can present the efficiency gap, and I think it's important to go into it because it turns out to matter for this analysis. And which one you use depends on the question you want to answer. So the way that the efficiency gap sort of emerges naturally is as a seat share. So this 30% thing is actually a seat share. It may not be immediately obvious, but it is. And that just comes out in the math. So that natural output is seat share, and that's just the seat advantage you're getting relative to the total potential advantage that you could get in seats. So 30% again in this example. But then you can also express it, because it's a seat percentage, you can express it in terms of raw seats instead. All you have to do is take that 30% number and take 30% of the total number of seats, which in this case is 5. And then you can express the efficiency gap as raw seats. In this case, it'd be 1.5 seats out of 5 total, right? The seat share version is really, I think, best for state legislatures, because in a state legislature, power is always relative to the total number of seats. So, for example, 1 seat in the California State Senate means more than 1 seat in the State Assembly, because the State Assembly has more seats total. So it's always relative to the total number of seats that you're getting an advantage. For Congress, it really kind of depends on the question you're wanting to answer. Sometimes it's seat share, sometimes it's seats. If the question is impact on party control in Congress, then raw seats is really what matters. 1 seat means the same thing for party control in the US House of Representatives, whether that one seat is coming from California or from Arkansas, right? But if you're worried about sort of culpability, did some institution intend to produce a particular advantage, then seat share may be the better way to go, because a larger state could have a larger raw seat gap by accident. It's easier to produce more extra seats by accident in California because we have a lot of seats, right? Whereas, like in Idaho, the maximum advantage you could get would be 2, right? So I'm going to present both. And I'll just note that when my co-author and I were proposing thresholds, we suggested a 2-seat threshold for sort of taking a second look at something when you're looking at raw seats. So, all right. We've got all that under our belts. Hopefully everybody's with me, and I didn't lose anybody along the way. How does the efficiency gap for the CRC look? I will look at that in 2 different ways. One, comparing the CRC plan to the previous plan drawn by the state legislature. And then I'll look at the California plans in the context of all the plans nationwide. So here, just to orient you a little, do I have a pointy thing? I do have a pointy thing. So this gray mass here is all of the other plans in the nation as a whole. Where it's higher, there's more plans. Out here at the tails, in extreme, for extreme efficiency gap values, there's not as many plans. And this 0 point, 0 in the efficiency gap is basically fair. So the closer you get to this 0, the fairer you are, according to the efficiency gap. And then I've got the 2 plans, the one drawn by the state legislature that's in teal here, and that line marks where it lands in this distribution. And then the CRC plan is the 2011 plan, and it's in reddish, orangish color, right? So for the assembly, the 2 lines look pretty similar. And now keep in mind that because the state legislature drew a bipartisan gerrymander, there's actually not much reason to think that they would draw a plan that would benefit one party or the other. It's meant to sort of freeze in place the status quo, and that doesn't necessarily advantage one party or the other. So it's not terribly surprising that the state legislature didn't draw a plan that was biased toward either the Democrats or the Republicans. We get basically the same result for the Senate, although the magnitude of the shift does shift in a Democratic direction for the CRC, but still puts it within the sort of center of this distribution of all the other plans. And note that it still is below that. So both the last one down here, you can see it's a little under 2%. And on this one, it's a little under 6. So neither one crosses that threshold that my co-author and I suggested might deserve further scrutiny. And then for Congress, it kind of depends again, right? So if you're looking at seats, raw seats, there is quite a significant increase relative to the general distribution of all plans. So it's about 1 seat extra for Democrats under the CRC plan compared to the previous plan. And so there is now sort of a mild tilt, right? It looks very large, but it's 1 seat. And again, we suggested 2 seats as a threshold. And of course, California also has a lot of seats. So when expressed in terms of seat share, the difference is much smaller, though it is shifting slightly in a Democratic direction. We can also break these down. So those were all plan averages over the life of the plan. We haven't had as much life in the CRC plan as in the last one, but nonetheless, averages. We can also break that down and report it year by year, right? And what we see when we do that is that a lot of the difference that you see between the 2 plans is actually a function of one election year, 2008. So there isn't that much. It is on average more Democratic, but it's up and down. There's no sort of consistent sign of a greater bias under the new plan. That's the Assembly. Here's the Senate, where it's all over the map, right? Partly because the Senate has fewer seats, so it's a little more volatile, and there's more estimation that has to go into it. And then here's for the U.S. House, right? I'm actually not sure that's the right graph. Competitive races, yeah, that one's wrong. Anyway, trust me, it also looks roughly similar, right? So there's no consistent change. It's kind of up and down. The averages, there's a little bit of change, but there's no consistency like you might expect. And more to the point, often the first year when they have most control over what the plan would be like, the first year there isn't much bias at all. All right, what about competitiveness? Okay, so how do I define competitive? Well, it's much simpler. You can all breathe a sigh of relief. So this is very straightforward. Just districts where the outcome falls between 45% and 55%. So nobody won by too much. That's the basic idea, right? I did try some more kind of sophisticated, complicated measures, and they produced the same results. So the simple one seemed the best. And again, I'm going to do the same idea, CRC versus state legislature, and California versus other states. So in this case, both the CRC plan and the state legislature, so there's a similar idea, right? Except now we have the percent of races that are competitive along the horizontal axis here, and so everything ends at 0 because you can't have negative percent competitive. Both the CRC plan and the state legislative plan are on the low side of competitiveness. But the CRC plan is much more competitive than the state legislative plan. That's for the Assembly. Here's for the Senate, same idea. The CRC plan is a little more competitive than the state legislative plan, but they're both still kind of on the low end nationwide. However, for Congress, the new CRC plan is actually on the high end nationwide for competitiveness, as well as being more competitive than the previous plan. And then I can do the same thing that I did before with sort of breaking it out over time. And you can see again that a lot of the differences have to do with, are driven by, the size of the differences is driven by this sort of outlier year of 2008. If you were to remove that, the difference between the state legislative plan and the CRC plan would actually be even larger. So you'd have even a larger increase in competitiveness. Here it is for the state Senate, similar story. And that looks familiar, doesn't it? That's the graph we saw earlier, but it's actually in the right place here. And this is for Congress. You can see that the competitiveness is much more consistently up for the House delegation. So what can we take from all of this? Well, first of all, the CRC plans are about as fair as the previous plans. They tilt a little bit more toward the Democrats, but not to a degree that would cause any consternation. And there's no sense that there's any consistent advantage over time. It kind of bumps up and down. It's the kind of thing that you would imagine could emerge just accidentally. It's too small to be anything else. They're also more competitive than the previous plans. And that competitiveness is a little bit more consistent than the increased tilt toward the Democrats. So that competitiveness in more recent elections has been more consistent. But I will say that for the state legislature in particular, the plans, both the current plans and the last plans, tend to be on the uncompetitive side nationwide. That may say more about California than it does about anything else, because California, our Democrats and Republicans live in different places. So it's a little hard to draw districts that are super competitive. What might we want to do as a result of these findings? Well, the first thing I would say is I think we should use the future. These are my recommendations for future iterations of the commission, because we're going to be coming up soon on choosing the new members, and this is sort of my love letter to them. My suggestion is use all the information available. So the CRC, the first time around, decided not to look at any partisan data, anything about which party was performing well in different places. And they had a very sensible reason for doing that. They felt that the text of the law was easiest to follow. And the text of the law said, again, don't advantage any party or incumbent. They felt that was easiest to do defensively if they just didn't look at that information at all. And so they wouldn't have any chance of knowing the information necessary to produce a biased plan or to benefit some incumbent. But there's nothing in the law that says that you have to take that approach. And I think it might make sense to use those data, but use them specifically to evaluate plans that you draw and make sure that they are fair and competitive. The competitive part's a little bit dicier because all the law says is don't benefit any incumbent, but I think that it kind of translates in many ways into a competitiveness kind of metric. And this is the idea here is that, first of all, in the first time around, the people who testified before the commission had more information than the commissioners themselves, because they were able to look at the partisan data when the commissioners didn't. The second thing is that in the intervening decade, we'll have a new set of commissioners who are new to the job, but in the intervening decade, some of the same characters will be planning on how to influence the commission. And they will have presumably been gaming out different scenarios and developing strategies to try and influence the commission. Certainly in Arizona, what we saw was that the Arizona Commission worked pretty well the first time around, and then the second time around, it really ran into a lot of trouble. And so if we can kind of try and stay one step ahead of the people who are planning to try and undermine the commission, I think that's a good thing. And I think one of the ways you could do it is to use all the information available. If you do that, I think it's important to pick the goals in advance. So pick your metrics. I would advocate for the efficiency gap, but you can sort of pick your poison. Pick neutral, systematic metrics for both fairness and competitiveness, and try and hit those targets. And if you pick them in advance, then once you draw the plans, you can't be accused of sort of making up your metric to justify a decision that you already made. I also think it's worth considering using some of the latest techniques in the redistricting field. There's a lot of work being done on random automatic map generation. So there's some really super smart people who are developing good methods of just having computers generate maps according to certain criteria. And so you can say, I'm going to specify all the things that can be specified with a number about a plan. Anything that can be measured with a number, I'm going to set parameters and have the computer just generate a whole bunch of maps. You can generate millions of maps if you want to, but you don't need to for what I'm suggesting. But generate some maps, have it narrow it down to just the ones that meet certain criteria, and then pick amongst those, or use those as a starting point. But the idea here is to sort of get the creative juices flowing, to be willing to think outside the box, but leverage computers because they can do certain things much faster than people can. And so it might be a useful tool for the commission to consider. And that's it. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. As was noted before, if you can please wait to have the microphone brought to you before you ask your question, that would be great. Okay, all the way in the back.
Thank you. How does the top two election system in California now skew or not skew your results?
So the one way in which the top two complicates this analysis is that in order to calculate an efficiency gap, you have to you can't just treat an uncontested race on its face, because an uncontested race is not a good representation of the partisan balance of a district, because one party doesn't have a choice, right? And the same party races under the top two, as far as the efficiency gap is concerned, they operate like uncontested seats, because there's no chance for people to vote for somebody of the other party. And so the way that you deal with the uncontested races is use a variety of advanced statistical methods to just plug in your best guess. It's called imputation. It's a very common methodology in statistics. And usually that's fine because you're not filling in too many seats. But in California, since the top two, you've had to fill in more seats, so that makes the estimates a little bit more unstable. But other than that, it doesn't really make any difference, because we're concerned about what's the partisan performance of the seats. And it might be that the top two, if you could make a case that it's producing different candidates perhaps running in certain seats, maybe people would be more willing to cross party lines, and you'd get a slightly different result for that reason. I've got a report that's going to come out in a few months that suggests maybe that's not what's going on. But anyway, I don't want to give away too much. So I think the main way in which it affects the analysis is that you have to impute more seats. It's like about 1 in 5 seats. And then on top of that, the uncontested ones as well. So, yeah, here. Wait for Mike. Oh, well, sorry, we have one in the back.
As I testified in 2008, wondering how ethnicity, also how the, shall we say, the problems you perceive in Arizona perhaps could be addressed. Grand jury was what I suggested as a methodology to assist in this distribution.
So the question is, what are the ways to avoid the Arizona problems? A lot of the problems with Arizona, I think, stemmed from the very structure of the commission. So I think we are already probably in better shape than Arizona because we have a larger commission and we have more potential swing votes on the commission. We have 4 independent members instead of just the 1 for Arizona, and the process of appointing the members of the commission is a little bit more robust. So I'm not as worried about it in general, but I still think the people who want to influence the commission are going to be gaming out how to do it, and we should be doing the same. Those of us who want to think about ways to help the commission survive. So, yeah, here. Wait for the mic.
Talking about competitiveness in individual districts and the ability of the voter to gain representation in the state assembly or the U.S. House, it seems as though the more competitive the district, the less ability for the party that well, say the race ends up 51-49. That means that 49% of all voters will get no representation in either the state assembly or the U.S. House. And if the race is won by 70-30, then on looking at it, that might be even more fair because Tom McClintock would win by 70-30, and there are very few of the other party in that district anyway. So competitiveness seems to cause voters to have less opportunity for representation in the body.
So if every district were 51-49, you would have and that would presume, if every district were 51-49, then the state itself would be 51-49. And then you'd have a winner-take-all system, right? One party would win all the seats. It'd also be a very competitive system, so it could flip easily. So I agree that would be bad. But the important thing is what's the distribution of all the seats, because there's always going to be some seats where it's competitive, some seats where it's uncompetitive. If all the seats are uncompetitive, then there's not much chance for, it's essentially a matter of the people in the middle of the range of voters who change their minds are completely disempowered in a completely uncompetitive system. If it's a totally competitive system, like 51-49 in every seat, then they have all the power, right? When they switch their votes, they completely determine the outcome. So I feel like it makes more sense to have some that are competitive, some that are not, and take that approach instead, sort of have somewhere midway. The efficiency gap, one of the features of that I didn't talk about here, is that it does imply a particular relationship between vote share and seat share that just comes out of the math of it. It says for every extra 1% of the vote that a party gets, it should get an extra 2% of the seats. So there is a sort of competitiveness built into the efficiency gap. If you had a zero efficiency gap over the entire range of possible vote outcomes, you'd have a kind of a responsive system in that way, but not super responsive and not uncompetitive.
I'm Randy Hicks of the California Green Party. Okay, so now the 4 independent people, I guess they could vote green, but I really see a problem with this. I really do. When we thought that the Redistricting Commission was going to be fair to all parties, but it turns out it's only 2 parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. I guess maybe that's kind of the way it votes. But my question is, if they're going to relook at this again, isn't there a possibility to bring in the other parties, or do they matter? And also, when you were talking about, he was talking about 70-30, some districts are very red and they're never going to be competitive ever again. And some districts are just cut that way because they're gerrymandered. My question is how much of a chance does this commission really have if they're already gerrymandering Congress is already doing what they're doing already? That's my question, and the third party one too.
So as far as the third party one, you're wondering about members of the commission that would be third party? Well, you could certainly revisit the law and change it. As it's written right now, there's always a chance that the independent bloc could have some Green Party people in it, but it's not guaranteed by any means. So you would have to change the law in order to make sure, right? There's only 14 members on the commission, so there's only so many opportunities anyway. Then the other question was something about, can you?
Congress is doing their thing already. How does the commission make sure that they don't get caught up with Congress is trying to do like gerrymandering districts, having influence, you know what I'm saying?
So because other states are gerrymandering,
Yeah.
I mean, we have, in some sense, we have unilaterally disarmed, right? If that's what you mean. And there's not, I wouldn't say that's a reason not to pursue a reform like this. But it was a concern that certainly the Democrats had at the time, that they weren't going to have their opportunity to sort of extract as many seats as they could on the other side. But beyond that, I don't know quite. I mean, there is this court case, right, that could affect all states, but we don't know quite what they're going to do yet.
So I'm with the League of Women Voters, and we helped write this law. And I wanted to say that we consciously did not include competitiveness in that list of criteria. And the reason is because we live in enclaves. We don't live in a general mix of people. And the other reason is that we carefully said communities needed to be kept whole. And the idea is to empower communities to elect their officials. So it may be that you have a community that is going to elect somebody with 70% of the vote. Well, that person is then going to go in fully empowered and not feel like I need to really worry about my next election because I know this community is behind me. And they're going to so their voice is stronger. So there is a real reason to not have competitiveness in that list of criteria. And I think what you've shown is that competitiveness kind of falls out a little bit as part of looking at things as communities.
Yeah, so I mean, you're right that the competitiveness is not in there anywhere. It's sort of sneaks in a little bit with the don't benefit any incumbent part, but it's not explicitly in there. I would also say that regardless of what the next commission decides to do with any of these issues, there's still the prioritized criteria, right? And they need to satisfy those first, and that does include communities of interest, which I actually feel like the communities of interest provision is an important sort of, it's an important way to make sure that the people who feel most passionately are heard, right? And any law that's going to be effective over the long haul has to hear the most passionate voices, or it's going to be doomed. So it's a way to make sure that those voices can be heard, because it doesn't have a number that you can assign to it that says this is, quantitatively, this is what your community of interest is. So, yeah.
Yeah, kind of related to that last question. It seems like it would be pretty easy for the commission to kind of take this, or other commissions in other states that you could imagine, taking this too far and basically still gerrymandering, but gerrymandering for the purpose of creating competitive seats and making sure that each party has the right vote share, versus just looking at those communities of interest and saying, okay, let's put rural areas together, let's put urban areas together, and suburban areas together, and so on and so forth. How do you guard against that as in the commission? Because I think we all would agree that it's important that it be at least somewhat partisan fair. But on the other hand, maybe that's not the most important thing. Maybe you really, because partisanship changes over a 10-year period, maybe what you really want to do is look at just making a map that makes sense to the average person. And so how do you guard against, I guess, a commission taking this too far?
Well, I mean, the only way you could is to hope that they do it responsibly, right? I mean, and that's the best that you can hope for from the commission model in general, right? Is that they take their charge seriously and that they act responsibly. There's always a chance of something going off the rails. I think what is different now is that there are, the state of the metrics has improved to the point where you can have some benchmarks that you're trying to hit and feel pretty confident about it. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't prevent something bad from happening with the commission. It just helps to make sure that those who are trying to influence the commission from the outside have less leverage to do so.
Yeah, I think this gentleman in the back with the Green Party, unfortunately, the third parties are kind of out of luck with the top two in place in California, so that's pretty sad. But I think what we're all struggling with here is that districts aren't really just red and blue. They're really purple. They're made up of all kinds of different people, not just Republicans, not just Democrats. And so I think the problem is the single-member district itself that just can draw a red or blue district where only one party gets elected. And if you're not a member of that party, you are not really represented in the People's House. So I just wondered if you had looked at the a bill that's been introduced into Congress that would change that, called the Fair Representation Act. It was introduced by Representative Byers, I think, from Virginia. And for those of you here in the audience, I suggest you might want to look that up, the Fair Representation Act.
Okay. I'll consider that a plug for the Fair Representation Act. I have not, no. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me make it. My name is Stan Forbes. Let me just say I'm a commissioner. And your presentation I had two questions. I'm a declined to state. Excuse me, declined to state. How does this model, one, take into account, this is a red-blue model, Democrat-Republican model, when in fact the fastest growing group in California are the independents. So how does that take into account? Also, how does it take into account the fact that the registration has so shifted since 2001? The Republicans have just been eviscerated. How does that, if at all, affect your calculation?
So to answer the first question, this is just an analysis of the two major parties and how people are voting. So it operates from the fact that those are the options that are given to them, right? The second question was, what was the second question?
The second question is that how does the fact that the registration has so shifted?
Oh, yeah. So the way that the efficiency gap works is it's telling you what seat share you should get given the vote share that you're getting. And so if the vote share shifts in a Democratic direction, that's fine, as long as the seat share also shifts by a certain amount. So again, the shift is, the efficiency gap says for every 1% shift in the vote, you should get about another 2% of the seats. You start from, if you have half the vote, you should always get half the seats. And then from there, for every extra 1% you get an extra 2% of the seats. And so if the vote share shifts in the state to the Democrats, as I think arguably it has, they should also just get more seats as a result. If they're getting too many more seats, then that suggests there might be a problem. If they're getting too few seats, also maybe a problem. Does that answer your question? Yeah. And I think maybe this will be the last question because we're at 1 o'clock.
All right. Well, I'm not affiliated with any group. My question has to do with the competitiveness issue. I think we heard about maybe some disadvantages with competitiveness, but I always had the impression that the redistricting, one of the goals was to try to have less extreme candidates so that you could have people that were a little more middle of the road. And one of the things contributing to the dysfunction we have is that we have too many people too far at one end of the extreme or the other, and it would be beneficial to have more in the middle. So I don't know if I misunderstood that as one of the goals of the commission, but I wanted to ask about that.
Yeah, so there's no question that it was sold as a way to produce more competitive districts. If you look at the voter guide from the elections where these issues were decided, those were some of the selling points. Make for more competitive districts, make people have to move to the center and so forth. So I think that's another reason why I feel like it's an important thing to keep in mind if to the extent that you can legally as a goal of the commission, because not because it's legally mandated, but because politically speaking, for the survival of the commission, it would be best that it didn't accidentally produce an uncompetitive plan, because it could undermine the commission moving forward. Okay, thank you very much.